Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of The Empowered Patient, where we dive into your health questions and recent trends in the health and wellness field and see what's actually true according to the research, and more importantly, what's going to serve you best on your health journey. So today's topic is caffeine tolerance and sensitivity. And this question actually came up as a result of a social media poll I did a couple of weeks ago, where I just reached out to you and asked, how many of you enjoy drinking coffee and tea but feel especially anxious or sensitive after consuming it? And the results were overwhelming. Over 80% of people who responded said, yes, I do consume coffee and tea regularly and I feel these adverse effects, but I keep consuming it. So what's going on there? Let's talk about that today. So coffee is one of the most widely consumed psychoactive substances in the whole world. Over 400 million cups of coffee are consumed by Americans every day, and more recent research suggests that about 90% of US adults consume caffeine daily. Additionally, it's a billion-dollar industry, and we probably know this because our cup of Starbucks costs more than a gallon of gas, and yet we are in the drive-thru every day. So let's talk about the basics of caffeine first, and then we'll dive deeper. So caffeine is chemically known as 1,3,7-trimethylxanthine. Try saying that 3 times fast. It is naturally occurring or can be found in the coffee bean, the tea leaf, and some shrub seeds like yerba mate and guarana, as well as the cola nut and cocoa. It's commonly or most commonly ingested. That's the most common way to take it in. And because it is both water and fat soluble, it very readily crosses the blood-brain barrier, and after consuming can be found in most all of our bodily fluids, including amniotic fluid. Most consumers report feeling the effects of caffeine after about 10 to 15 minutes of consumption, with peak symptomatology or peak increased focus, alertness, and maybe jitteriness and some of that happening around 30 to 45 minutes after consuming. This is interesting because caffeine has a half-life of 6 hours. So before we go further, let's talk about what half-life means. Half-life just means at peak concentration, how long does it take to reach half of that concentration? So when we consume caffeine, it reaches a peak concentration in our bodies, and it takes about 6 hours to get to half of that amount of caffeine. So if we're consuming caffeine throughout the day, we're probably getting to bedtime with some caffeine still left in our system, and that can cause some trouble with sleep and insomnia. Those are just the basics with caffeine. And fun fact, even though we have that trademark buzz after consuming a cup of coffee or maybe black tea, in its purest sense, caffeine is not actually a stimulant. Then what's going on? Let's talk about caffeine's molecular or chemical composition. So, caffeine is actually very similar in molecular structure to another neurotransmitter that we all have, adenosine. Adenosine floats freely through the mind, through the brain, we'll say, and it tends to parallel with activity. So when we're doing stimulating activity, the levels of adenosine rise, and then once it reaches a peak concentration, adenosine begins to bind to adenosine receptors. As the adenosine binds to the receptors, we tend to experience more vasodilation, a decrease in heart rate, a decrease in blood pressure, and it has an overall calming sedative effect. Enter caffeine. Caffeine, because it looks like adenosine, can bind to the adenosine receptors, blocking adenosine activity. When the caffeine blocks the adenosine from binding, the adenosine levels stay risen in our brain, and thus it prolongs that stimulant effect. So here's a fun fact about that. We don't just have adenosine receptor in our central nervous system, but we have them in the periphery and in all of our organs as well, including the kidney and the colon. So when we consume caffeine and it binds to the adenosine receptors in our kidney and colon, you can probably guess what happens. We're running to the restroom. To continue that talk, caffeine is a diuretic, meaning it increases the frequency to urinate. This is something to consider when we're deciding whether caffeine is a yay or a nay for us, because if we're consuming caffeine pretty regularly and daily, not only are we urinating out water, but we're also urinating out many essential vitamins and minerals, including calcium, magnesium, potassium, zinc, vitamin C, and the B vitamins, which tend to be related to stress reduction. So when we're experiencing potentially chronic and increasing amounts of anxiety, panic, mood swings, and fatigue, this is another area to look into, that we may be potentially deficient in some vitamins and minerals as a result of increased elimination due to caffeine consumption. So those are the basics of molecular structure in caffeine. Let's take a look at some of the research on pros and cons of consuming caffeine. So because it's consumed so often and marketed to us so heavily, we've probably learned many of the benefits to consuming caffeine, but I'll just briefly review those that I came across here. So some of the benefits associated with consuming caffeine include increased cognitive abilities, such as improved performance on a memory task, increased psychomotor vigilance, such as increased reaction time in a task. Caffeine appears to be related to neuroprotection. That is, it has an inverse relationship with cognitive decline due to normal aging, as well as neurocognitive degeneration, as in Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. It appears to be related positively to reduced cancer risk, including breast cancer, colorectal cancer. It appears to be related to a decreased risk of all-cause mortality. And because the beverages that we often consume containing caffeine, such as coffee and tea, contain polyphenols, which are antioxidants, it can be a source of antioxidants in the diet. We can get these antioxidants from consuming other fresh fruits, vegetables, and whole foods, but in the standard American diet, caffeine tends to be one of the more prominent sources of these antioxidants. These are just some of the benefits. Let's take a look at some of the risks. So, those for whom it may be contraindicated to consume caffeine include those who may be experiencing heart-related illnesses or symptomatology. Caffeine tends to be a vasoconstrictor. It can increase blood pressure. So if you're already dealing with elevated blood pressure and heart-related symptoms such as arrhythmias or tachycardia, caffeine can increase the risk of these adverse outcomes. Caffeine can enhance the effect of certain medications and drugs. In fact, a review that I found, and that I'll link below, found that over 400 drugs have known interaction effects with caffeine. So caffeine may stay in our system longer due to taking these drugs. A couple of examples include asthma-related medications and hormonal birth control. Hormonal birth control is thought to increase the half-life of caffeine by about double, so it stays in our system for approximately 12 hours. And in pregnancy, consuming 2 or more cups of caffeine per day can increase the risk of pregnancy loss and low birth weight. Caffeine tends to stay in the pregnant system for about 16 hours until it reaches half the concentration. These are just some of the contraindications, again, included in consuming caffeine. Another one includes maybe struggling with certain mental illnesses, especially those that tend to have higher elevations of dopamine or include dopaminergic pathways. Some of these include schizophrenia, panic-related disorders, mood disorders such as bipolar, and substance abuse disorders. Just some things to keep in mind. Now I'd like to mention some of the limitations of the research. So most of the research that I'm citing and most of the research available on caffeine consumption is observational in nature, meaning there weren't randomized controlled trials, we didn't have a clinical group and a control group, and many variables may not have been controlled for, such as diet, social relationships, spirituality, other things that we know enhance well-being and quality of life. So because of this, we can't say with absolute certainty that these effects are causative. We can't say that caffeine causes prolonged life or causes a decreased risk in cancer, for example. There just appear to be relationships or associations. So we just take it with a grain of salt. Additionally, some of the observational research is conducted with specific cohorts, meaning people of specific qualities. It may be in all women, for example. It may be only in Norway or in Europe. Some of these research studies were done. And so we can't generalize to the total population. And considering as an individual, we may have different factors that have different implications for consuming caffeine. So this is just the big picture research. Let's start looking at the individual factors that may be related to our individual level of sensitivity and tolerance. Talk about a normal consumption. So when we're talking about a normal healthy amount to consume per day, most researchers and health practitioners recommend about 180 to a max of 400 milligrams of caffeine consumption per day. To give you a ballpark, that's about 2 to 4 cups of caffeinated coffee per day. And that is in healthy adults, meaning we're not dealing with a chronic illness or an acute illness. We're not dealing with chronic stress. We're sleeping 8 hours a night like a baby. You get the picture. So this is when most of us tend to lean on caffeine, and this is actually when we're dealing with these factors, caffeine can have more of the adverse type effects on us. Additionally, those of us who are hypersensitive to caffeine may feel these adverse effects at a much smaller amount of caffeine, anywhere from 30 to 50 milligrams, and we may begin to feel heart palpitations, sweaty palms, shakiness, anxiety, and even some blood sugar swings. So we may experience drinking caffeine and then feeling lightheaded and dizzy, as an example. So that's hypersensitivity. And you probably know where you fall on that spectrum. Then we have a full-blown caffeine allergy. And this, much like other foods, can include hyperventilation, closing off of the throat, swelling of the lips and the face, hives, eczema, and even more psychological related symptoms such as full-blown panic attacks, disorientation, fogginess, dizziness. Caffeine allergy can be tested like any other food allergy through skin and other tests, and I'll put a link below to a practitioner who recommends certain testing. Additionally, the proteins specifically in coffee beans can be cross-reactors for those who are intolerant to gluten. So this is something to pay attention to as well. And a fun fact here is that according to some research on heritability, the heritability of coffee consumption can be as high as 50%. It is thought that a small percentage of the population, around 10%, tend to be caffeine hyporesponders, meaning they don't have the adverse or even the cognitive enhancing benefits of caffeine, and rather caffeine can make them sleepy or they don't feel anything at all. So as we're going through this, where do you feel your individual sensitivity level is? Do you feel like you're a hyporesponder, a hyperresponder? Let's keep going to see some of the genetic links that are involved in caffeine tolerance. So the CYP1A2 gene is the gene that codes for caffeine metabolism. Interestingly, this is the same gene that codes for metabolism of all of our steroid hormones, and this metabolism happens in the liver. This is why, for example, when we're consuming hormonal birth control, it can interact with or affect the metabolism of caffeine because it's all being done in the same place. So it is thought that about 50% of the population has a variant of this gene that causes them to be a slow metabolizer of caffeine. And the slow metabolizers of caffeine tend to have or experience more of the adverse effects of caffeine. Although there are fast metabolizers of caffeine and they may experience different adverse effects to caffeine. You can learn whether you're a slow or fast metabolizer through certain genetic testing, and I'll include a link below, but the most common one that I've been aware of is through the company 23andMe. So that's genetic metabolism of caffeine. We've got the big picture of research, and we've got some of the smaller, more individual level sensitivity and tolerance things to consider. And keep in mind that lifestyle factors are really important here. So even if we are a fast metabolizer or even a hyporesponder, taking certain over-the-counter or prescription drugs, undergoing a period of prolonged stress, not getting a good amount of sleep, all of these things can impact how we consume coffee and how we react to it. So with that, I want to leave you with one other topic, and that is, what if I just love the taste of coffee and I know I'm hypersensitive, so I consume decaf? Well, if it's just an issue of hypersensitivity, decaf may be the way to go. And there are many ways to getting to a decaffeinated coffee or tea, and I would recommend looking for the Swiss water processed version of those things so that a chemical solvent isn't being used to extract the caffeine from the substance. But if you are responding adversely to coffee or tea or things that traditionally contain caffeine due to a reactivity, such as a cross reaction if you are gluten sensitive or intolerant, that's something that I would pay attention to. Additionally, some doctors say that even decaf coffee is implicated in anxiety, headaches, and blood sugar regulation, as well as difficulty with weight loss. So if these are things that you are currently working on, consuming decaf coffee is something to consider. Whew. All right, so we've covered the basics with caffeine. We covered some of its neurochemistry. We covered its molecular structure. We covered a big ballpark area of research on the pros and cons, as well as some individual factors to consider. How are you feeling about your consumption with caffeine? What did you enjoy most about this video? What parts of caffeine consumption, tolerance, and sensitivity did you find most interesting? I would love to hear from you. So if you got benefit out of this video, please like and comment below. Additionally, if you have health questions or health concerns and you would like a deep research-guided dive into them, please comment below or reach out to me at jdingles@gmail.com and I would be happy to cover it. Thank you so much. Until next time.